Hello, Star Wars fans. I am back again for another one of my book reviews. And if you can't tell from the hat and the shirt, I'm getting ready to talk some Boba Fett today. And more generally, I'm going to talk about bounty hunters in Star Wars through the latest book I'll be reviewing, Tales of the Bounty Hunters. And really, before I get into the specifics of the book itself, one of the most fascinating things to me about Star Wars is how popular some of the side characters become. Really, I mean, these bounty hunters have become like their own sub-brand of Star Wars. Kind of like something comparable to like the Disney villains, which is even more comparable now that Star Wars is owned by Disney. When they brought Cad Bane into the Clone Wars show, they made a big deal about it. And, it's like, oh, we're adding another bounty hunter to the lineup. And, if you look at trading cards and comic books and other novels, bounty hunters typically play like a big part in Star Wars stories, both in the EU and by all appearances in this new canon that's been created for the sequel trilogy. And it's really fascinating to me that happened because the bounty hunters in the original movies don't really do much. You have Greedo, who appears briefly in one scene in the original film. He's just there to get shot at, and, Han shot first, by the way. You have that quick scene in Empire where Darth Vader is talking to the group of bounty hunters on the ship, and Boba Fett obviously sticks around for the remainder of the film. And then Boba Fett is around at Jabba's palace in Return of the Jedi. But for the most part, bounty hunters don't play that big of a role in the original Star Wars films, but they kind of just took on a life of their own and are really the best example of side characters and, elements of the films that weren't really that big of a deal and just expanding on them through the expanded universe, and a bunch of writers and creative minds just using their imagination to expand on those characters and give us more material with them, and take those opportunities to flesh them out and make them interesting characters, even if they didn't play big roles in the film. And actually, this book right here deals specifically with the bounty hunters in Empire Strikes Back. There are other books done like this that I really like. There's Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, which has Greedo's tale in there. There's Tales from Jabba's Palace, which I've read both of those. I believe there's one for the Empire and for like the New Republic or something like that. Just basically a bunch of short stories giving you stories about certain characters that you may have seen in the films that didn't have a lot of screen time but may have left an impact in one way or another. And those stories take the time to flesh them out as characters, give them personalities, and let you get to know them, and really make those scenes in those movies that don't seem like much and make them more interesting if you know the backstory associated with those characters. So, I might review the Mos Eisley Cantina book at some point. I might review Jabba's Palace at some point as well. The problem with doing those, though, is that those books have a lot more stories, like I think close to 15. And trying to review 15 stories in a single video like this would be kind of daunting. A daunting task, I think, is the best way to put it. The Bounty Hunter book only has 5, so that's a little bit more manageable. And like I said, it deals only with the bounty hunters that appeared on the ship with Darth Vader in that key scene in Empire Strikes Back. Bounty hunters, we don't need this, scum. And really, what happened in that scene, to me, is one of the best examples of the fans' just imagination just running wild and just attributing attributes to a character. Because as growing up, we all assumed that Boba Fett was like the biggest badass in the galaxy. He is the, he's the man with no name. He's, that Clint Eastwood, kind of. He's that character in Star Wars, and he's just the biggest badass in the universe. But we don't really have anything to really base that off of, except for that one line from Darth Vader where he specifically points at him and says, "No disintegrations." That line gave Boba Fett his entire reputation, and really allowed people like myself and people like the writers of this book to, again, expand on Boba Fett's character and just take our perception of him and really make something out of him. And all these characters. Actually, one of the interesting things about this book is that many of the characters, the bounty hunters, kind of take on personalities and traits of, like, movie characters. IG-88 is very much like the Terminator. Dengar, Payback, he's very much kind of like RoboCop in a way. There's a little RoboCop in there. Bosque, there's a little bit of Predator in there. Boba Fett, I already compared him to Clint Eastwood. Forlom and Zuckuss are a little harder to spot, but I was thinking maybe Lone Ranger and Tonto, but that's a bit of a stretch. But that was also interesting to kind of take similarities that those characters have to pre-existing movie characters and kind of use those same attributes to and weave them in with like the Star Wars canon. I think that was very interesting. So basically we get these 5 short stories. One thing I do like, I do want to point this out, all the Tales of books, or at least the 3 that I've read, they have like these illustrations of the characters right before each story. That's IG-88 right there. I thought that was a nice little touch. It's just nice to have it. Here's Boba Fett. He's the last one in the book. You gotta save the best for last, right? And, yeah, going over these stories, I'm going to review them all individually and talk about them individually, but what we have here, Therefore I Am, The Tale of IG-88. I love the Descartes reference, by the way. That's really cool. As someone who took philosophy classes in college, it's always nice to see some of that make it into something, you know. Kevin J. Anderson wrote that one. He is a very prolific Star Wars writer. He's the editor of most of these compilation books. And, you know, he wrote the Jedi Academy trilogy. I've already reviewed Darksaber, which was his. He's written several others. And very prolific Star Wars writer. So this is another piece of work of his I get to review. You get Payback, The Tale of Dengar, written by Dave Wolverton. The Prize Pelt, The Tale of Bosque, written by Kathy Tyers. Of Possible Futures, The Tale of Zuckuss and Forlom, written by M. Shane Bell. And then finally we have The Last One Standing, The Tale of Boba Fett, written by Daniel Keyes Moran. And going over these stories, I guess I'll start with IG-88 since his came first. I mentioned that he's written very much like the Terminator. He's an assassin droid that comes to life and kind of, well, I say he's like the Terminator. He's kind of like the Terminator and Skynet mixed into one because he gains his own intelligence. And there are several IG-88 clones around. So it's not just the one robot. There's actually 4 or 5 in total. I'm trying to remember. And they're all lettered. It's IG-88 A, B, C, and D. So I think there's 4 in total. And there's an IG-72 who ultimately doesn't fit in anywhere. That was an odd detail. I thought maybe he'd pop up in one of the later stories to try and connect everything, but he didn't really do anything. But yeah, so these 4 IG-88s, they take over an Imperial manufacturing facility and use it to enact their plan of universal dominance, and they are going to take over the universe. And somehow that leads to them having to become bounty hunters to hide the trail so the Empire doesn't find them or something. Like, it's really weird and over the top, but overall, it is so crazy because it ultimately ends with one of the IG-88s, his consciousness being downloaded into the new Death Star for the Battle of Endor. And I'm like, how the fuck did... And again, the imagination that some writers have for the expanded universe, I don't know where Kevin J. Anderson got the idea. It's like, hey, let's download IG-88's consciousness into the fucking Death Star and add that extra layer to the Battle of Endor. I have no idea where anybody comes up with that, but it's such a wild and crazy idea that I kind of liked it. And, similarities that this story has with all the other ones, Darth Vader fixes into all of them. And that's actually one of the knocks I have on these compilation books. Less so with the Jabba book. The Jabba's Palace book didn't have this problem as much. But the Cantina book especially, this problem is all over the place. Where you get to that point where every single character was present during the key scene in for example, the Cantina. In this book, it would be the scene on the Star Destroyer where Darth Vader's giving them the mission to go find Han Solo. And it gets a little repetitive to have that same scene written about in every single story, but I guess that's the necessary evil of writing a compilation book of characters that all shared screen time together. Because, like I said, they didn't have a whole lot of screen time outside of that one scene, but, yeah, I thought it was really interesting how they managed to expand on IG-88 here and obviously give him a feud with Boba Fett. Boba Fett and Darth Vader fix into just about every story, which is also very interesting. Every bounty hunter has their own ship. I believe IG-88's was the IG-2000. Not the most creative name, but he's also a robot, so, you know, it stands to reason that they would number things. Or they're like a Planet X alien from a Godzilla movie. Everything is numbered here. The monster is 0. But, yeah, I thought this was a really good start. I mean, the first story in this book is the craziest one, and I was like, wow, that's... the other ones are going to have a hard act to top, because that one's pretty wild and crazy. And again, if you like killer robots and you like the interesting ties that it makes to the original trilogy, specifically the end of Return of the Jedi. They even, after he's been downloaded into the core of the Death Star, he starts fucking around with the Emperor too, which is very interesting. And kind of funny that he would go that far to, like, dicking around with Emperor Palpatine, who's somebody that you do not mess with. So yeah, I thought that story was very interesting and very off the wall and crazy, but a lot of fun to read, so I was okay with it. Next up was Payback, The Tale of Dengar. I mentioned he's kind of like RoboCop. They mentioned that he was in a race with Han Solo, where he was in a crash and got horribly disfigured, and now he's like got remnants of his human memories and emotions. He just knows that he has to destroy Han Solo. And so he's like driven by vengeance, and he became a bounty hunter, wound up on that Star Destroyer with Darth Vader, got the mission, and he's like, alright, I gotta go hunt me some Han Solo. Boba Fett turns out to be like the bane of his existence and stops him along the way of doing that, but also along the way he winds up making a connection with a woman and falls in love, so it's, he's human after all, and he's not completely a machine. Again, kind of like RoboCop. Yeah, I thought the ending to the story was really weird, but also very funny. Where after the constant cat and mouse game between Boba Fett and Dengar, Dengar actually ends up saving Boba Fett, who escaped the Sarlacc and winds up in the middle of the Tatooine desert, scarred and burned. And Dengar ends up saving him, and through just an odd coincidence that the man he saved just happened to be Boba Fett. And as it turns out, they make amends, and Boba Fett winds up being the best man at Dengar's wedding, which is like, okay. It's kind of an odd ending to the proceedings here, but I'll take it. It's really, really weird, but yeah, a fun story. And again, Dengar was probably the least interesting of the bounty hunters on in Empire Strikes Back, at least visually. He just kind of looked, well, I'll just say, if you saw the Robot Chicken sketch, he looks like he has a toilet paper motif to him, and actually they did a really funny bit with that where his ship was shaped like a toilet, and actually in the story the name of his ship is the Punishing One, which after you see the Robot Chicken sketch gives it a whole nother meaning. So very interesting take on Dengar. Likeable story. I thought all 5 stories were very likable, and yeah, I got to know a little bit more about one of the lesser interesting bounty hunters in the Star Wars canon, and it was a good story. I liked it. Next up was The Prize Pelt, The Tale of Bosque. This one was probably my least favorite one of the bunch, just because it doesn't really go anywhere. At least I didn't feel like it did. Bosque ends up teaming up with these other bounty hunters to hunt Han Solo and Chewbacca. He wants to get Chewbacca, because Chewbacca is the prize pelt. And they explain that Bosque species, the Trandashans, I think that's how it's pronounced, they hunt Wookiees, and their whole society is based on like hunting and pleasing the scorekeeper. I think that's what it was called. Their deity, and they please the scorekeeper by collecting as many pelts as possible. So very interesting, and I think we all kind of, again, I made comparisons to the Predator, and it's like I think we all kind of assume that Predator's society works in a similar way, where everything's just shaped around hunting and pride that you obtain through getting the ultimate catch and those type of things. That's all very interesting. I believe, again, keeping up with the ships, I believe Bosque's ship name was the Houndstooth. I believe it was. I think the setup for Bosque's character is very interesting. The problem is that he teams up with these other bounty hunters, one of them being a Wookiee, and they fully intend to screw him over. He's going to screw them over, and it's just like, you're just kind of waiting. It's like, all right, well, who's going to screw who over first? They screw him over and end up, like, humiliating Bosque, and that's kind of the end of it. And it didn't really, I don't know, I kind of would have liked to have seen a showdown with him and Chewbacca. I think that would have been a good place to take it. Natural thing to do. And he's a good physical match for Chewbacca, this big, hulking reptile thing. It would have been interesting, it would have been fun to read about, but as is, it's just kind of ordinary. It's just kind of, I mean, that happened. I didn't hate it. It was just kind of there. And Bosque was actually one of the inverse of Dengar. Bosque was one of the more interesting looking ones in Empire Strikes Back. And actually, he got the glory shot. I mean, Boba Fett ended up getting the most screen time, but in that scene, Bosque gets the bit where you see his foot standing there on the bridge, and he's just looking down at the Imperial officer that insulted bounty hunters, and he's just like, looking down at him, and he kind of got the glory shot there. So I was always kind of a Bosque fan, and I felt like he got the weakest story here out of all of them. But the one that surprised me, the Tale of Forlom and Zuckuss. These guys, first of all, again, really expanding on the characters. In Empire Strikes Back, there's really no indication that they're partners, but they are, so okay, I'll go with it. And they really made them into very interesting characters. Zuckuss is a very kind of spiritual, intuitive, perceptive being, and Forlom, he's a droid, so he's straight up like he's trying to understand that about him, but doesn't really understand. He's trying to be able to perceive things the way that Zuckuss does. So you got an interesting personality clash there between the two, and what ends up happening, they end up forming a pretty good bond. I felt like by the end of it, I felt like, oh, it's cool that these two are partners, and they do kind of like complement each other in a weird way. And they end up kind of being heroes by the end of it, which was an interesting way to write them. And I'm sure that most other expanded universe materials I've read about Forlom and Zuckuss don't portray them in that way. Actually, keeping in lines with their ship, I forget what the name of their ship was. Sorry, that one didn't interest me as much. I remember it had like the least interesting name of all of them. So, but in any case, I'll look it up on Wikipedia after this. It's fine. But yeah, I really liked the way they were written here. I was like, man, I'd like to see more stories with these guys. I'd like to see more about them and see if Forlom is able to understand Zuckuss, and Zuckuss hope his health problems get okay. They explain that he's got like an issue with his lung, that's all I'll say, and leads to some tense moments towards the end of the story. But yeah, I thought both characters came off really likable, and for characters that really weren't as interesting as like the Boba Fetts or the IG-88s or the Bosques, they became very interesting to me after reading the story. So kudos there. And again, that's probably, of the five, they were probably the ones that were the least desirable to do, but they crafted one of the more interesting stories in the book. So again, major congratulations on that one. But the final story, got to talk about this one, Last Man Standing, Boba Fett. And what I really liked about this one is that it wasn't centered around the events of Empire Strikes Back like all the other ones were. This one takes place after Return of the Jedi, after he's escaped the Sarlacc, because, again, we all assumed, as fans, that Boba Fett survived that. We all was like, there's no way that killed Boba Fett, come on. And actually, there's a story in the Jabba's Palace compilation that shows how Boba Fett escaped the Sarlacc, and that was also very good. And if I ever get around to reviewing the Jabba's Palace book, I definitely want to highlight that story. But this one takes place a little bit concurrently with the events of Return of the Jedi, and then long after it, which was very interesting. And it wound up being by far my favorite story of the book, and that's saying a lot because I've been praising this book and I really enjoyed it, but Boba Fett's tale was the most interesting to me because it didn't explain, and this is where George Lucas screwed up with the prequels, and I hate to keep harping on George, but it's like, look, I never wanted to know where Boba Fett came from. I do and I don't, because part of the appeal of Boba Fett is the mystery, the fact that we know nothing about him, and that's what makes him interesting. But getting dialogue from him and getting him interacting with characters and putting him in situations where he's motivated to do something and seeing how Boba Fett reacts to those things, that makes him interesting too. Just as an example, there's a scene in this book where he interacts with Leia in Jabba's palace, where it's, Luke and Han are going to be sent over to the Sarlacc pit, and that night, I believe I've got my timeline. Yeah, that sounds about right. And the night before that happens, Jabba sends Leia to Boba Fett's quarters late at night to utilize her services, shall we say. And Boba Fett straight up says no. He's like, nope, not doing it. And it turns out Boba Fett believes that not only rape, but premarital sex is wrong. Now, how a cold-blooded killer could suddenly go like, no, premarital sex is wrong, and rape is wrong. And it's like, really, that's where you draw the line, you cold-blooded, psycho killer? But again, it's like, it's just an interesting piece of information about Boba Fett's code and his personality. It's like, all right, that's interesting, never would have imagined that. And he even goes as far as to, like, he tells Leia, is like, look, you sleep in my bed because I don't want Jabba to know that I didn't take up your offer because that'll insult him and I don't want to get in his bad graces. So you can just take my bed, we'll go to sleep, and we'll just act like something happened when nothing really happened. So it's also interesting to see how Boba Fett plays the game and trying to keep on the good side of, his benefactors like Jabba. Very interesting, well-written scene. And then the story jumps to after the events of the Sarlacc, and actually long after Return of the Jedi. I believe it was like 15 years after the fact. Han Solo and Leia, they have their family, they have their kids, and Boba Fett returns to the place where he originally met Han Solo, and after he's recovered from the Sarlacc and everything, and the story ends with those two foes. And again, it's one of those weird things that we have in our minds as fans. We just always assume that Han Solo and Boba Fett have this big rivalry, when again, it's never really made a thing in the movies. We just kind of assumed it, and which that just tells you the imagination of Star Wars fans and the many writers who have taken on these characters. But I love how the story ends, with both of them basically pointing their guns at each other, and we don't know who shot who or what's going on, or we don't get a definitive ending. It ends on a cliffhanger, and I love that. I think that's great because it sparks discussion, and it's kind of this cold, chilling ending to the story, and perfectly captures the spirit of someone like a Boba Fett, and the ending shrouded in mystery, much like Boba Fett is. So it's strangely appropriate for the character. So do I recommend Tales from the Bounty Hunters? Absolutely. Love the book. I've already spoiled it for you, so you probably don't need to read it now. But one of the more enjoyable pieces of Star Wars literature for me, this was one that I read years and years ago, back when I was in grade school, and I loved it back then. Glad to see that it still holds up now. And I highly recommend it. I recommend any of the compilation books. Again, if you're interested in finding out more about those side characters in the movies that only appear for like 2 or 3 seconds, or maybe only have one scene to really help them stand out, pick up those books, because there's plenty of interesting stories written about those characters. And again, it's those characters that really help make up the expanded universe and the various stories that we have now, and really help to flesh out the Star Wars universe and make it what it is to us. So, yeah, Tales of the Bounty Hunters, it's great. Love it. I definitely want to cover more Boba Fett and Bounty Hunter related material in the future. This is just the start, but we'll have more down the road as we come along. But that is the end of this Star Wars review, so I will see you all next month for the next one.